Chapter 1. The beginning of it all. Amelia had always been the kind of girl who believed in true love. From a young age, she fantasized about the fairy tales her mother would read to her, imagining that one day she'd meet someone who would sweep her off her feet, someone who would hold her hand through life's trials and triumphs. She was only 24, but she'd convinced herself that she had found that love in David. David was everything Amelia had ever dreamed of: charming, caring, and fiercely loyal. They'd met during their sophomore year at college, and their connection had been instantaneous. He had that kind of quiet confidence that made everyone around him feel safe, but to Amelia he was different. He made her feel like the center of his world, like she was the only thing that mattered. They'd started dating soon after they met, and within months, it felt like they'd been together for a lifetime. Their lives intertwined easily, and the future seemed to be a constant flow of laughter and shared moments. David was a few years older, and while they were both on the same page about their career goals, he always seemed to have a little more certainty in his life. He had a job lined up at a prestigious firm in the city after graduation, and Amelia was in the process of applying to grad school. They often talked about the future, about traveling together, getting a cozy apartment, maybe even getting married one day. Amelia saw nothing but a horizon filled with possibilities, all of them wrapped up in David. But somewhere along the way something shifted. It started small, those little moments when David was less present. The texts that came later and later. The evenings when he'd say he was going to the gym, only to return hours later with a vague excuse about hanging out with friends. It wasn't that Amelia suspected anything at first, but the changes in him, though subtle, didn't go unnoticed. She shrugged it off at first. After all, he was busy with work and preparing for his big career move. Maybe she was being paranoid. Then came the night of the party. It was one of those nights that Amelia had never really cared about. A college gathering, people she didn't know, and music that thumped in her chest as soon as she walked through the door. David had mentioned he was going out with some of his old friends, and while Amelia wasn't particularly excited, she agreed to go because she didn't want to sit at home alone. She told herself that a little distraction would be nice. When she arrived, she immediately felt out of place. It was a crowd of people she didn't know, and everyone seemed to be there for the sole purpose of getting drunk and flirting. It didn't take long before she found herself standing by the food table, nursing a glass of wine in one hand, her phone in the other. She texted David to see where he was, but there was no reply. She tried to ignore the knot in her stomach as her eyes wandered through the sea of strangers. And that's when she saw him. David was talking to a woman at the other side of the room, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. He was laughing, his smile wide, his eyes bright in a way Amelia hadn't seen in weeks. The woman was tall, with long blonde hair and a body that looked as if it belonged in a magazine. Amelia's heart sank as she watched them. Watching the chemistry between them was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a friendly chat. They were close. Too close. She couldn't hear their words, but it was clear from their body language that this wasn't an innocent conversation. A jolt of panic shot through her. She quickly looked down at her phone, willing David to text back, but there was nothing. The weight of that silence was suffocating. Amelia felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of anger and betrayal rising within her chest. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. But a small part of her, the part she'd been trying to ignore, had already made up its mind. After what felt like an eternity, David finally glanced in her direction. His smile faltered when he saw her, and that's when Amelia knew. He wasn't just caught off guard. He had seen her walking in. He knew she was there, and yet, he hadn't come over to greet her. Instead, he stayed by the woman, oblivious to Amelia's growing sense of discomfort. Before Amelia could react, she turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythmic beat that echoed her rapid heartbeat. She couldn't breathe. She needed air. She needed to think. Outside, the cool night air hit her like a splash of cold water. Her mind was racing, and yet, she couldn't shake the image of David's face as he'd looked at her in that moment. He had known. He had known she was watching, and somehow that made everything worse. Amelia wasn't sure how long she stood outside, letting the chill of the night seep into her skin. She didn't want to go back in. She didn't want to confront him, not yet. She wasn't sure what she'd do if she saw him again. The feeling of betrayal was so overwhelming. It felt like a physical ache in her chest. It was a feeling she never imagined experiencing in her relationship with David. She dialed his number, but after the first few rings, she hung up. She couldn't talk to him yet. Not now. Instead, she walked down the street, her mind spinning with a mix of emotions. Was this the beginning of the end? Chapter 2. A cracking foundation. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion and quiet tension. Amelia couldn't escape the image of David with the woman at the party. Her fingers hovering nervously over her phone, unsure of what to say. She had tried to keep her distance from him since that night, a cold barrier that she wasn't sure how to break. She still loved him, or at least she thought she did. But something inside her had shifted, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the feeling of betrayal clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. David had called her several times, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but she couldn't bring herself to pick up. She wasn't ready to hear his excuses, wasn't ready to hear how he might try to explain away the way he'd looked at her that night. She needed space, or at least that's what she told herself. The truth was, she didn't know what she needed anymore. It was a Saturday when David finally showed up at her apartment. He stood at her door, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she opened the door, her body instinctively tensing. She had expected this moment, had imagined it over and over, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to say or how to act. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice thick with guilt. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside, allowing him to enter, though she wasn't sure what kind of conversation they could have anymore. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. She closed the door behind him, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed her since the party. David looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the familiar objects that had once made her feel safe and at home, objects that now felt foreign. The bookshelves, the cushions on the couch, the coffee mugs they had picked out together. They all seemed so insignificant in the face of what had happened. "I've been calling," he said, his voice almost pleading now. "You're not answering." Amelia crossed her arms over her chest, trying to protect herself from the hurt that was threatening to rise to the surface. "I've been busy," she lied, her voice tight. "I've been thinking." "Amelia, please," David said, stepping closer. "I didn't mean for you to see that. It wasn't what you think." Her breath caught in her throat, the words he spoke igniting a fire of anger within her. "What I think," she repeated, her voice rising. "It was exactly what I think, David. I saw you with her. You were laughing. You were close. You didn't even care that I was there." David flinched at the accusation, his face momentarily falling. But then he regained his composure, taking a step back as if to put some distance between them. "I care about you, Amelia. You do. But what you saw, it wasn't what you think it was." Her anger flared. "Then tell me what it was, David. Tell me why you were standing so close to her, why you couldn't even come over and say hi to me when I got there. Were you embarrassed by me? Were you?" "No," he interrupted, his voice rising in frustration. "I wasn't embarrassed. I didn't want to make things weird. You know how awkward I can be around new people. And with my friends from the old firm," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know I messed up, but I swear nothing happened. There's nothing going on between me and her." Amelia felt the rage inside her begin to simmer down, replaced by a deep ache in her chest. She wanted to believe him desperately, but a part of her, deep down, knew something was off. The way he had been acting lately, the way he couldn't look her in the eye for too long. Something had changed between them, and it wasn't just the party. It had been happening slowly, like cracks forming in the foundation of their relationship, little by little. "I don't know what to believe anymore, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step back, her hand clutching the edge of the couch as if it were the only thing anchoring her. "You've been distant. I've noticed it. We've barely talked in weeks, and when we do, it feels like you're not even really here with me. Like you're somewhere else." David's expression softened, and for the first time since entering the room, he seemed genuinely remorseful. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm, but Amelia stepped back, not wanting his touch right now. "Amelia, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I've been distracted. With work. With everything. And I've been pulling away from you because I didn't know how to handle it. But I never meant to hurt you." She looked up at him, the tears she had been fighting back threatening to spill over. "So this is your excuse? That you've been too busy with work? That you couldn't even see how you were hurting me by pushing me away?" She shook her head, feeling the sting of betrayal once again. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, David." David's face hardened slightly, his jaw clenching as if he was fighting to keep his emotions in check. "Are you saying you're done? That you want to break up?" Amelia's heart sank. She didn't want to say it. She didn't want to hear the words come out of her mouth. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep living like this, in this limbo between love and resentment. She needed something real. She needed someone who would be there, who would prioritize her, not just when it was convenient but always. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I want anymore." David's face fell, the disappointment and hurt evident in his eyes. "Amelia!" She held up her hand, cutting him off. "I need some time, David. I need to think about this. About us." With a heavy sigh, David nodded, backing away toward the door. "I'll give you space. But please just know that I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." He left without another word, and as the door clicked shut behind him, Amelia collapsed onto the couch, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him again. But a part of her was afraid that no matter how hard she tried, things would never go back to the way they were. Chapter 3: The Storm Within. The days that followed David's departure from her apartment were heavy with silence. Amelia had expected the distance to bring clarity, but instead it only deepened her confusion. Every day felt like a tug-of-war between her heart and her mind. Her heart ached for David, for the love they had shared. But her mind kept replaying the images of him with that woman at the party, and with each passing hour, the knot in her chest grew tighter. She threw herself into her work, spending long hours in the library and attending her grad school interviews. Yet, no matter how much she tried to focus, the thought of David, his face, his voice, kept creeping back into her mind. She tried to fill the silence with distractions, but nothing worked. It wasn't until one afternoon, when she was sitting in a coffee shop, that the first crack in her resolve appeared. Amelia sat at a small corner table, sipping her coffee, eyes glazed over as she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone. She hadn't expected it, but there at the top of her feed was a photo. It was a picture of David, smiling, his arm around the blonde woman from the party. She was sitting beside him, her head tilted toward his shoulder as they posed for the camera, a shared intimacy radiating from the shot. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the image for a long time, her fingers trembling as she zoomed in on their faces. There was no doubt in her mind now. The chemistry was undeniable. They looked happy, too happy. Her phone vibrated in her hand, the sudden movement pulling her from her daze. It was a text from David. "Amelia, I know I've asked for space, but I need to talk. Please meet me tomorrow. I'll be at the usual spot, 7 p.m. Amelia's pulse quickened. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen as a mixture of anger and uncertainty churned within her. She didn't know whether she should reply or not. What was there left to say? She wanted to tell him she didn't need his explanations, that she had seen enough to know the truth. But her heart kept whispering that she owed it to herself to hear him out, to get the answers that she was so desperately craving, even if it meant facing the one thing she wasn't sure she could bear. The possibility that the relationship she had built everything around was falling apart. By the time the evening arrived, Amelia had made up her mind. She had to go. She had to face him one last time. She couldn't keep running from the truth, even if it broke her. The usual spot was a small bar near the university campus, a quiet place that David had always favored. It was dimly lit, with jazz music playing softly in the background. Amelia arrived just a few minutes before 7, feeling the weight of every step as she made her way inside. Her eyes immediately found David, sitting at their old booth in the corner, his back to the wall, a glass of whiskey in front of him. His face was strained, his posture rigid, as if waiting for something or someone to bring the tension to a head. When he saw her, his face softened slightly, but his eyes betrayed the same guilt that had been lingering in his voice. He stood as she approached, pulling out the chair for her, but she declined, opting to stand instead. She couldn't sit. Not yet. "Amelia," he said, his voice low. "I'm glad you came." She nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. "Let's just get this over with, David." "I saw the photo." David froze. His face paled, and for a brief moment, he looked like he was about to say something, but no words came. Instead, he stared at the table, his jaw clenched. "Amelia, I know you saw it," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I swear I didn't plan for it to happen." Her eyes narrowed. "Then explain it to me. Explain why you were so comfortable with her. Why you let me walk into that party and see you with her like that." David swallowed hard, struggling to meet her eyes. "It's not what you think. I never meant for you to see us. She's just a friend. Someone from work. Someone I've known for years. And yes, we had a moment at the party, but it wasn't what it looked like." Amelia could feel her frustration boiling over. A moment. David, don't lie to me. I saw the way you were looking at her. You weren't just talking to her. You were with her. Don't sit here and pretend that you weren't flirting. You weren't being just friendly." David sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "Amelia, I never meant to hurt you. Swear. I was confused. I've been confused for a while now. I didn't know how to tell you, but I knew I couldn't keep living a lie." Amelia took a step back, her heart thundering in her chest. "A lie? What do you mean by that?" David hesitated, his eyes darting to the side as if weighing his next words carefully. He took a deep breath and then finally spoke. "Amelia, the truth is, I haven't been in love with you for a while now." Her breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of what he had just said. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," David continued, his eyes now fully on her, regret etched across his features. "I thought I could fix it. I thought I could push through it. But the truth is, I've been lying to both of us. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to let you down, but it's unfair to you to keep pretending." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She felt dizzy, like she was floating outside her own body, hearing his words but unable to fully comprehend them. She had spent so much time wondering whether her suspicions were true, whether her fears were justified, and now, here they were. But it didn't feel like a victory. Felt like a loss. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth sooner? Why let it go on like this?" David shook his head, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to lose you. I thought I could find my way back to you, but I couldn't. I'm sorry, Amelia. I never wanted to hurt you." Amelia took a step back, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces as she realized that the love she had once felt for him was now just a shadow of what it used to be. Everything she had believed in, everything she had hoped for, had been built on a foundation that was already crumbling. "I don't think we can fix this," she said softly, the finality in her voice leaving no room for argument. "I need to let go. I need to move on." David didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this moment. And just like that, everything they had shared, Every dream, every hope, every promise slipped through her fingers. As Amelia turned to leave, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had come looking for answers, but now she realized that sometimes the truth isn't something you want to hear, something you have to accept. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Amelia walked out of the bar without another word. The cool night air hit her face like a slap, but it did nothing to numb the ache deep inside her chest. She had always imagined that if this moment ever came, if she ever had to confront the truth about David, it would feel like closure. She had expected that her heart would somehow feel lighter, that knowing the truth would make it easier to walk away. But instead, all she felt was emptiness. The finality of it weighed on her like a heavy cloak, and the silence between them had been deafening. She walked down the dimly lit street, her thoughts spiraling, her feet carrying her without direction. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to be far away from him. The night felt like a blur of shadows and half-formed thoughts. She passed familiar places, the cafe they used to frequent, the park bench where they'd sat on warm summer afternoons, the grocery store where they picked out ingredients for dinner just last week. But now they all felt foreign to her. Everything they had once shared seemed like it belonged to someone else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she pulled it out, hoping for a message from her friends, maybe some kind words to help ease the sting. Instead, it was a notification from her social media app. Post. From David. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to look. She really didn't. But her finger betrayed her as it tapped the screen, and there, staring back at her, was the photo of David with a blonde woman, this time taken at another event. It wasn't just the image itself that cut so deeply, but the caption that came with it. Feeling lucky to have found someone special. Amelia's heart shattered as she stared at the words. She had already known that something had been off between them, but to see him publicly, with someone else was like a final slap in the face. A confirmation that everything she had been holding on to had been nothing more than a lie. Her mind screamed in protest, but all she could do was stare at the screen, her fingers numb against the cold glass of her phone. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, lost in the endless scroll of comments from people congratulating him on his new love, and tagging him in supportive messages. The pain was sharp, cutting through her like shards of glass, but she forced herself to look away. She had to move on. She had to. With shaky hands, she tucked the phone back into her pocket and continued walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she forced herself forward. She had to let go. She couldn't keep living in the past, tethered to a relationship that no longer existed. As Amelia walked aimlessly through the city, a new sense of determination began to take root inside her. It wasn't the kind of strength that came from any one person or any one thing. It was her own, born from necessity. She had spent too much time worrying about David and their broken relationship, too much time searching for answers that would never come. She couldn't afford to keep doing that anymore. She needed to rediscover herself, the person she had been before she let love blind her to her own worth. The next morning, after a restless night spent tossing and turning, Amelia woke up to the harsh reality of her new life. She had no answers to the questions she had been carrying, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep looking back. She started with the small things. She deleted the photo from her phone. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it was also the first step. She unfollowed David on social media. She packed away the mementos of their time together. The concert tickets, the love notes, the little gifts he had given her. They were all reminders of a past that no longer had a place in her life. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Amelia felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in months. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and started drafting her application essays for grad school. She had been putting them off for weeks, too distracted by David and their unraveling relationship. But now there was nothing stopping her. She was doing this for herself. For the first time in a long while, she was doing something that didn't revolve around anyone else. She smiled to herself as she typed, the words flowing effortlessly. It wasn't that she had completely healed or moved on from David, but she was beginning to realize that her happiness couldn't be dependent on him, or on anyone else for that matter. She was stronger than she had given herself credit for, and she would prove it. A few days later, as Amelia sat in a local cafe, sipping her coffee and reviewing her grad school essays, her phone buzzed again. She had been expecting some kind of message from her friends or family, but when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Natalie, one of her closest friends. Natalie had always been there for her, through the highs and lows of her life. She tapped the notification with a sense of curiosity and dread. "Amelia, I have to tell you something. I didn't want to say anything before because I didn't know how. But after everything that happened, I think you should know the truth." Amelia's brow furrowed as she read the message. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her mind racing. "The truth. I've seen David with the blonde girl a few times now. But it's not just that. There's something I didn't want to tell you because I thought it might hurt you too much, but now I think you need to know. The truth is, they've been seeing each other for months, Amelia. I didn't want to say anything until you were ready, but I can't keep it from you anymore. I'm so sorry." Amelia's stomach lurched as she read the words. A cold chill ran down her spine, and for a moment everything around her seemed to blur. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of emotion that washed over her. She stared at the screen for what felt like hours, trying to process what she had just read. David had been seeing someone else for months, all while he was still with her. The devastation of it all hit her like a wrecking ball, knocking the breath out of her. She felt sick, betrayed on a level deeper than she could put into words. But then, as the initial shock wore off, something else began to rise within her. Anger. A fierce, burning rage that she hadn't known she was capable of. How could he do this to her? How could he lie to her for so long? For a long time, Amelia had tried to hold on to the belief that there was something worth saving, that maybe the relationship had just been a casualty of the stresses of life. But now there was no question. David wasn't the person she had thought he was. And she didn't need to keep searching for the answers. She already had them. The storm inside her had finally passed, and in its wake, Amelia was left with something new. A resolve strong and unwavering. It was time to rebuild, time to move forward. She wouldn't be defined by what David had done. She would define herself starting now. Chapter 5. The Power of Letting Go. The next few weeks were a blur of motion and reflection for Amelia. She threw herself deeper into her work, using her busy schedule as a shield against the emotional fallout of her breakup with David. Grad school applications were in full swing, and she buried herself in the process, determined to focus on something positive, something she could control. But the sting of David's betrayal was still there, lurking beneath the surface of her day-to-day life. The revelation that he had been seeing someone else for months left a scar that wouldn't heal overnight. Every time she ran into a mutual friend, every time someone mentioned his name, the memories came rushing back. Of the way he had looked at her, of the promises they had made, of the future they had talked about so often. All of it had been an illusion. Lie. Amelia had learned to wear a mask, to smile when she needed to be present when she had to. But behind closed doors, the loneliness crept in. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the life she thought she had. The life she thought she would have with him. Her therapist had advised her to allow herself to grieve, to let the emotions come instead of pushing them away. But it wasn't easy. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her strength. Admitting that she was hurt felt like admitting weakness, something she wasn't ready to do. Yet with each passing day, the truth became more apparent. She couldn't move forward unless she dealt with the pain, unless she allowed herself to feel it fully. One afternoon, as she sat in her favorite park, watching the leaves sway in the breeze, Amelia realized that she had been avoiding her own healing. She hadn't been grieving properly. She had been holding it all in, afraid to let go. It was time to stop running. The decision came quietly, like a whisper in the back of her mind. She needed to let go of the pain, of the hurt, and of the person who had broken her heart. That night, after a long day of working on her essays and catching up with a few friends, Amelia found herself sitting at her desk, her computer screen glowing softly in the dark. She opened her inbox, the cursor hovering over a new message from David. It had been the first email from him in weeks, an apology of sorts, filled with empty words and half-hearted explanations. He claimed he had made a mistake, that he wanted to talk, that he missed her. The familiar ache returned in her chest as she read through his message, but it was different this time. The sadness was there, yes, but it was paired with a sense of resolve. Amelia's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could respond. Give him one more chance, listen to his side of the story. Maybe he would explain it all away, maybe he would tell her that he had been confused, that it was just a phase, that he loved her. Maybe he would try to win her back. But deep down, Amelia knew that she couldn't go down that road again. She had already given him everything, her time, her trust, her heart. It wasn't enough. And it would never be enough. Instead of replying, she opened a new email draft. Her hands were steady as she typed, her voice clear and firm. David, I've thought about everything you've said, and I've come to a conclusion. I've spent too much of my life waiting for people to change, for things to fix themselves. But the truth is, I don't need to wait anymore. I am moving forward. I'm no longer the person I was when we started this. I deserve more than what you've given me, and I deserve someone who will cherish and respect me from the start. Please understand that this is the end of our story. I wish you well, but I need to let go completely. Goodbye. She reread the message, feeling an odd sense of peace settle over her. She had no desire to continue the conversation, no need for explanations or apologies. This chapter of her life was over. It was time to close the book. Without hesitation, she hit send. For the first time in weeks, Amelia exhaled deeply, feeling the weight on her chest lift just a little. She had taken control of her own narrative. She had chosen herself. The days that followed felt different. Not perfect, but different. Amelia no longer lived in the shadow of her past with David. She focused on what lay ahead. Grad school was on the horizon, and she could see a future that was hers alone, one that didn't need to be validated by anyone else. She spent more time with her friends, rekindling relationships that had been put on the back burner while she had been wrapped up in her toxic relationship. She took long walks in the park, read books she had been meaning to finish, and for the first time in a long time, found herself smiling without any pretense. In a way, she was rediscovering herself. The woman she had been before David, before she had given her heart away and let someone else shape her world. One afternoon, as she sat at her favorite cafe, sipping a latte and sketching in her journal, Amelia had a moment of clarity. She realized she had been too focused on the idea of love, on the notion that it defined her worth. She had been seeking validation from someone else when, in reality, she had everything she needed within herself. She was enough just as she was. As the weeks turned into months, Amelia's confidence grew. Her application essays had been submitted, and she had started to hear back from some of the schools she had applied to. Her friends were there to celebrate every small victory, every step forward. She began to see the future with a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. And then, one evening, as she was walking home from a gathering with friends, she received a message that caught her off guard. It was from Natalie again. Amelia, I just wanted to tell you something. I think you should know that David's been struggling a lot. He reached out to me and said he regretted everything, that he was falling apart. He says he still thinks about you all the time. I'm not trying to make you feel anything. I just thought you should know. Amelia read the message, her heart momentarily racing. But this time it didn't stir up anger or pain. Instead, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had made her peace with David's actions. She had let go of the person he had been, and more importantly, she had let go of the version of herself that had clung to him for so long. She smiled to herself as she tucked her phone back into her bag. She didn't need to hear from David anymore. She didn't need his validation. She was living her life on her terms, and that was enough. And as the sun set over the horizon, Amelia knew that the future was waiting for her, full of possibilities, full of new beginnings. She had let go of what was holding her back, and now she was free. Chapter 6. Unseen Paths. The months that followed her final breakup with David felt like a series of small, steady victories. Each day, Amelia felt stronger. She poured her energy into her work, into her friendships, into rediscovering parts of herself she had forgotten. The lingering ache of betrayal had softened, replaced by a quiet resilience, a reminder that she had survived the storm and was now standing firm on her own 2 feet. The application results from the grad schools she had applied to started coming in. With each acceptance letter, Amelia felt her confidence grow. She was being recognized for her talents, for her work. She wasn't just someone's girlfriend, not anymore. She was Amelia, ambitious, driven, and capable of building a life that was entirely her own. One afternoon, as she sat in her small apartment, going through the last of the acceptance letters, she came across one from a school she had applied to on a whim, unsure whether it was the right fit. It was from a university on the West Coast, far from home and the memories of everything that had gone wrong. As she opened the letter, her heart skipped a beat. It was a full scholarship offer, an opportunity to continue her studies in a program that aligned perfectly with her career goals. The offer was everything she had hoped for: a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the remnants of the life she had lived with David. Amelia stared at the letter for a long time, considering the weight of the decision. Moving across the country would mean leaving everything she had known, stepping into a new chapter completely on her own. But deep down, she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. She picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Lily, who had been with her through every step of the journey. The call went straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's me. I just got an offer for a scholarship out west. I'm thinking about taking it. I know it's big, but I don't know. Part of me is scared to leave, but another part of me is excited. Call me back when you can. Talk soon." As the day drifted into evening, Amelia sat with the decision, weighing the pros and cons. She could stay in the city, finish what she had started, and try to rebuild in a place that was familiar. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she needed a clean break. She needed to be somewhere where no one knew her past, where she could reinvent herself without the weight of old memories anchoring her down. It wasn't just about escaping her old life. It was about reclaiming her independence, taking a step toward the woman she was becoming. She had no room for regrets, no time to waste on second-guessing herself. The answer was clear. That night, Amelia packed her bags. She didn't know exactly when she would leave. There were logistics to handle, arrangements to make, but the decision had been made. She was moving to the West Coast, to a future that was all her own. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Amelia told her parents, who were supportive but hesitant about the distance. She explained it to her friends, who, while sad to see her go, understood her need for the change. As the final days in her apartment approached, Amelia couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of emotions. There was sadness, of course, leaving behind the place she had called home for so long, but there was also a powerful sense of anticipation. It was time to turn the page. When the day of her departure arrived, Amelia stood at the doorway of her apartment, taking one last look at the space she had made her own. It was a quiet, unassuming place, but it had been her sanctuary during the hardest times of her life. She had found herself here, rebuilt herself here. But now it was time to leave. She closed the door behind her, locking it for the last time. The sound of the key turning in the lock felt final, almost symbolic. The flight was long, and Amelia's thoughts were scattered. But as the plane touched down on the tarmac of the West Coast city, a sense of excitement bubbled up inside her. She was no longer running from her past. She was moving toward her future. The city she had moved to was bustling with life. Tall buildings, busy streets, the energy of a place where anything felt possible. Amelia took a deep breath as she stepped off the plane, her heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. This was it. She was here, ready to take on whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, Amelia settled into her new life. She found a small apartment near the university, surrounded by unfamiliar faces but filled with the potential of new beginnings. Her professors were supportive, her classmates encouraging. She dove headfirst into her studies, eager to prove herself in this new environment. But as she settled into her new routine, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't the city itself. No, the city was vibrant and full of opportunity. It wasn't even the work. Amelia had always thrived in academic settings. It was more personal. She had left behind so much, but there was still a lingering sense of something incomplete. A quiet emptiness that crept into her thoughts in the late hours of the night. She thought about David less often, but when she did, it was with a quiet bitterness. It wasn't that she missed him. She had let go of that version of him a long time ago. But there was something about the way he had treated her that left a scar, a wound that hadn't quite healed. She had to remind herself that she was doing the right thing. She had to believe that leaving him behind was the only way to move forward. One evening, a few months into her new life, Amelia attended a student mixer at the university. It was a casual event. Drinks, music, and mingling with other graduate students. Amelia was enjoying herself, talking to people she had just met, when someone caught her eye from across the room. It was a man she didn't recognize, though something about his presence struck her. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident smile. He was talking to a group of students, but his gaze kept drifting toward her. Amelia couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on her, as if trying to place her, or maybe just intrigued by her. Eventually, their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else seemed to blur. He smiled, a warm and genuine smile, and walked over to where she stood. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but with a touch of curiosity. "I don't think we've met before. I'm Ethan." Amelia smiled, feeling a slight flutter in her chest. "Amelia. I'm new here actually. Just moved from out of town." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Wow, that's a big move. How are you liking it so far?" "It's a lot to adjust to, but I think it's exactly what I needed," Amelia replied, her voice steady. "New city, new start." Ethan chuckled. "I get that. I moved here last year myself. A lot of change, but it feels like the right place to be." There was something comforting about his words, about the way he spoke with such ease. Amelia found herself relaxing, the familiar tension in her shoulders easing as they continued to talk. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in a long while, Amelia found herself enjoying the company of someone new. Someone who had no idea about her past, someone who didn't carry the weight of her history with David. In that moment, Amelia realized something powerful. The future was an open road, full of possibilities, and she had finally learned to embrace it. Chapter 7. The Unspoken Truth. Amelia sat in her new apartment, the soft hum of the city outside a constant reminder that she was still in the midst of this transformation. It had been several months since her move to the West Coast, and although she had settled in well, something still lingered within her, a subtle but persistent feeling that she hadn't fully shed the past. But life had been moving forward, and so had she, one step at a time. Her newfound connection with Ethan had been an unexpected breath of fresh air. Their interactions had been light, easy, and fun, and he had a way of making her laugh without even trying. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and she couldn't help but feel a spark each time they spoke. But as the days passed, Amelia became increasingly aware of a new set of emotions. While she enjoyed Ethan's company and was genuinely drawn to him, there was still a lingering hesitation, a barrier she couldn't quite overcome. It wasn't that she wasn't ready to move on. She was. In many ways, Amelia had already moved on, physically, emotionally, and mentally, from the shadow of her past. She had taken ownership of her life, made it her own. But in the depths of her heart, there was still an unfinished story with David. A story she had never fully let go of, no matter how hard she tried. Ethan and Amelia had been seeing each other casually for the past few weeks. They had gone to dinner, to art exhibits, and even to a couple of weekend hikes. He was kind and attentive, and there was no denying the chemistry between them. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way she kept comparing him to David, something she hated herself for. Maybe it was the fact that she still wasn't entirely sure what she wanted from this relationship. One night, after a quiet dinner at a local Italian restaurant, Amelia and Ethan walked through the tree-lined streets of the city, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The night air was cool, and Amelia felt a deep sense of contentment as they walked side by side, their fingers brushing occasionally. But as they reached a bench by the water, Amelia felt a shift in the atmosphere, a tension she couldn't place. Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but not unkind. "Amelia, can I ask you something?" Ethan's voice was gentle, almost cautious. "Of course," she said, her heart skipping a beat as she met his gaze. She had the feeling that tonight was different, that something important was about to be said. "I just want to know, where do you see this going? I don't want to rush things, but I also don't want to waste either of our time if we're not on the same page," Ethan said, his eyes searching hers. Amelia froze, the question hanging in the air. She hadn't expected him to ask so directly, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Her mind raced as she thought about the answer. The truth was, she hadn't really allowed herself to think too far ahead. She had been so focused on healing from the past, on rebuilding herself, that she hadn't really considered what it meant to open herself up to someone else fully. I don't really know," she finally said, her voice soft. "I think I'm just figuring things out. You know, I've been through a lot that I haven't really processed yet." Ethan nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with a hint of disappointment. "I get that. But I don't want you to feel like you have to rush into anything. And I definitely don't want you to feel like I'm pushing you." "You're not," Amelia reassured him, though she felt the truth of her words shifting. The longer she sat with her emotions, the clearer it became. She was pushing herself, not Ethan. She was afraid of what a future with him might look like because she wasn't ready to let go of the past. Not completely. She wasn't ready to let go of the version of herself that had been intertwined with David. "I just don't know if I can be the person you need me to be right now. I still have a lot of stuff I need to work through," Amelia admitted, looking away for a moment as if the weight of her own vulnerability had become too much to bear. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Amelia, I'm not asking for anything more than what you're ready to give. Like you. But I also respect where you're at. And if that means taking things slow or not moving forward at all, I can accept that. What I care about is being here for you, no matter what that looks like." Her heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment, she was struck by the kindness and patience he offered. She had been so accustomed to the push and pull of her relationship with David, the emotional roller coaster, the drama, the lies, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be in something simple, something healthy. Ethan wasn't trying to control her, wasn't demanding answers from her. He was giving her space to figure it out on her own terms. And that made her feel more seen than she had in a long time. "I just don't know if I can give you what you want," she whispered, the weight of her confession hanging between them. "You don't have to know yet," Ethan replied with a small smile. "I'm not in a rush. If we're going to figure this out, we'll do it together. But only when you're ready." Amelia felt a sudden wave of gratitude and tenderness. She had never encountered someone like him, someone who wasn't trying to fix her, wasn't trying to rush her into something that wasn't right. He was patient, understanding, and kind. And that made her want to try, made her want to give herself the chance to open up again. After a long pause, Amelia looked up at him, her eyes filled with sincerity. "I don't know what this will look like, but I'm willing to see where it goes. If you are." "I am," Ethan said with a warm smile. "No pressure." As they sat on the bench together, the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, a shared understanding that neither of them needed to rush. It felt like a moment of clarity, like they had reached a turning point. Amelia knew she wasn't ready to dive into a full-fledged relationship, but she also knew she didn't want to let this connection slip away. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she was open to the possibility. The following weeks passed in a blur of study sessions, long walks with Ethan, and quiet evenings in her apartment. Amelia's life in the city was settling into a rhythm, and with each day, she felt more confident in her decision to embrace this new chapter. She was no longer defined by her past, no longer tethered to the memories of David. She had created a space for herself, one that was uniquely hers. And as she continued to explore her growing connection with Ethan, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to explore love again, on her own terms. But even as she grew closer to Ethan, Amelia couldn't help but wonder if David was still out there, somewhere, carrying on with his life. She couldn't erase the past completely, but she was learning how to live with it, to find peace in the present. The truth was, she wasn't afraid of the future anymore. She was ready to face it, no matter what it held. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Message. The weeks turned into months, and as the seasons shifted, so did Amelia's sense of self. Her routine at the university grew more fulfilling. She found herself absorbed in her studies, the work invigorating in a way she hadn't expected. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving, feeling more confident with each passing day. The sense of possibility that had once been an abstract idea was now a tangible reality. And then there was Ethan. Their connection deepened in ways Amelia hadn't anticipated. They spent more time together. Long dinners, late-night walks by the water, quiet moments where conversation flowed without effort. Ethan was patient, understanding, and he never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. He allowed her to take things at her own pace, respecting the boundaries she had set. In return, Amelia found herself opening up to him more than she ever thought possible. She began to share pieces of her past, the struggles, the heartbreak, and the lessons she had learned along the way. But as much as Amelia had moved forward, there was one thing she hadn't been able to shake: the feeling of an unfinished chapter. The thought of David had faded over time, but it wasn't gone. It lingered in the back of her mind, in moments when she found herself staring at the city skyline, lost in thought, or when she found herself comparing Ethan to the man David had been. It wasn't fair to Ethan, she knew that, but it was hard to shut out the memories completely. One evening, after a quiet dinner with Ethan, Amelia was sitting in her apartment, her laptop open in front of her as she worked on a paper for one of her classes. The hum of the city outside her window was a comforting background noise, and she was nearly finished when an email notification pinged at the corner of her screen. The sender's name made her freeze. It was from David. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. She hadn't heard from him in months, not since she had sent him that final email. The one that had been her way of closing the door, of walking away. And yet, there it was, a message from him. With a deep breath, Amelia clicked open the email. Amelia, I don't know how to start this, or if I even should. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, and I feel like I owe you an explanation. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know I can never undo the hurt I caused you. But I need you to know that I've been working on myself. I've been trying to understand why I did the things I did, why I treated you the way I did. It wasn't right. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I've changed. I miss you more than I can say. David. Amelia stared at the screen, the words swimming before her eyes. There was no anger, no rage, just a quiet numbness as she processed the message. The emotions she had worked so hard to bury began to resurface, unbidden and sharp. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. Hadn't thought about what she would do if this moment ever came. But here it was, a lifeline thrown out, an olive branch extended after months of silence. The question was, did she want to reach out and take it? Her heart raced as her mind battled itself. Part of her wanted to respond, to see if there was any truth in his words. What had he meant by working on himself? Had he really changed? Could he have changed? The other part of her, the one that had fought so hard to move on, told her to delete the message and forget about it. But Amelia wasn't that person anymore. She had moved past the woman who clung to hope in toxic relationships. She had learned the hard way that she deserved more than empty words, more than hollow apologies. Still, curiosity lingered. The emotional pull of the past was undeniable, and though she had built a new life, a new identity, A part of her wondered if David's apology could give her the closure she needed. She was just about to type a reply when her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Ethan. "Hey, just checking in. I know we had a busy week, but I've been thinking about you. Want to get dinner tomorrow? Maybe try that place you mentioned last month." The sudden shift in focus was jarring. Amelia stared at the message from Ethan, his warmth and thoughtfulness offering a stark contrast to the coldness of David's words. She had everything she needed right in front of her. Someone who cared for her, someone who had never asked her to be anything other than who she was. Someone who had respected her boundaries and loved her without trying to control her. The thought of replying to David suddenly felt like a betrayal, not just to Ethan but to herself. She had moved on, hadn't she? She had found a new path, a new future. Ethan had been there for her in ways David never had, offering kindness and patience instead of manipulation and deceit. And yet, the question still lingered. What if David's apology was sincere? What if he had truly changed as he claimed? Amelia took a deep breath and closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind. She didn't want to carry the weight of the past into her present. She didn't want to let David's shadow continue to cast over her life. After a long pause, she made her decision. She clicked the delete button on the email from David. She felt a brief pang in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of relief. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Lily. "You're doing great, I can tell. And no, you don't need to reply to that guy. You've got a real chance at something good here." Amelia smiled softly, feeling the warmth of her friend's support. She didn't need to look back anymore. Instead of replying to David's message, Amelia composed a new text to Ethan. "I'd love to have dinner tomorrow. I'll make the reservation. Can't wait to see you." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she pressed send, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't need to know what David's message had meant. She had made her choice. She was moving forward and she wasn't looking back. The following night, as she sat across from Ethan at the restaurant, laughing at a joke he had made, Amelia realized just how far she had come. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. She was no longer weighed down by the ghosts of her past. She had let go. And as she clinked her glass with Ethan's in a quiet toast, she felt a quiet but certain sense of certainty settle in her heart. She was finally free. Chapter 9. The Unexpected Visitor. Amelia woke up the next morning with a quiet sense of peace. The night before had been one of those rare moments of clarity, where she could feel the weight of the past finally start to lift off her shoulders. It wasn't that everything was suddenly perfect. There was still a lot to figure out. But for the first time in a long time she felt grounded, connected to the present, and, most importantly, in control of her own future. Ethan was right there beside her in that future, offering something genuine, something steady. And though she hadn't fully opened her heart to him yet, she was starting to. She could see the possibility of something real between them, something healthy, something built on trust. She spent the morning at her favorite cafe, sipping coffee and reading over her notes for the upcoming semester. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the space. Life in this new city was beginning to feel familiar in a way it hadn't before. She had planted roots here, strong roots, and the future seemed like a blank canvas, ready to be filled with whatever she wanted. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a text from Ethan. "Hey, thinking about you today. I know we're both busy, but I was wondering if you'd want to go to the beach this weekend. Just the two of us." Amelia smiled as she read the message. Ethan had a way of making her feel seen without trying too hard. The idea of spending time with him in such a carefree way appealed to her. It wasn't rushed or complicated. It was just simple. "That sounds perfect. I'd love that," she replied quickly before getting back to her work. She couldn't wait to spend time with him, away from the demands of school and life in the city. Later that day, as Amelia was heading home after class, she checked her phone once more. Voicemail. The number was unfamiliar, but she felt a tug in her chest as she pressed play. The voice on the other end was low, a little uncertain but unmistakable. Amelia, it's David. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you something. It's important. Can you please call me back when you get this? I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know the truth. I've never stopped thinking about you. Amelia's heart stopped. It was like a punch to the stomach. She had been so certain that David's message was just a fleeting attempt at closure. She had dismissed it. And yet here he was again, this time leaving her a voicemail, asking her to call him back. She hadn't heard his voice in months, but even now, the sound of it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. The way he said her name, soft, lingering, was all too familiar. The air felt thick, and for a moment, Amelia stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, her mind swirling with confusion and emotion. She hadn't expected him to contact her again. Not after the way everything had ended. She had thought he was finally out of her life for good. But now this. A new message, a new plea for her attention. Why now? What did he want? Her fingers hovered over the phone, unsure of whether to call him back or delete the voicemail and move on. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She had worked so hard to move on from him. But something in the pit of her stomach told her she couldn't just let it go unanswered. She had to know. Before she could second-guess herself, Amelia pressed the callback button. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before David picked up. His voice sounded hoarse, a little ragged, as if he had been waiting for this moment just as anxiously as she had. "Amelia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You called." Amelia didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. She had so many questions, but she couldn't find the words. Finally, she exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. "David, why are you calling me? After all this time, why now?" There was a long pause, and Amelia could practically hear him wrestling with his words. "I know I hurt you, and I know I can't undo that," he said, his voice filled with quiet regret. "But something happened, something that I need to explain to you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. And I think you deserve to know the truth." Amelia's heart pounded as she listened, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear what he had to say. The truth. What truth? She had heard every excuse from him in the past, every explanation for his mistakes, every justification for his actions. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding her chest. Another long pause. Then his voice cracked slightly. "I've been seeing someone," he said. "Her name's Sarah. I've been with her for the past few months. But Amelia, I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wanting what we had. I made so many mistakes, but I don't know if I can let go of what we shared." A chill ran through Amelia, and her grip on the phone tightened. This was not the apology she had expected. This wasn't an admission of guilt, or a plea for forgiveness. This was something different, something that felt far more manipulative. "I thought you wanted to move on, David," Amelia said, her voice colder now. "I thought you wanted to get your life together. You told me you were working on yourself." "I am," he said quickly. "I am working on myself. But God, I can't stop thinking about you. And I feel like I've made a huge mistake, not reaching out sooner. Please, Amelia. Need you. I want us to try again." Amelia's stomach turned as she listened to his words. It wasn't just guilt she heard in his voice. It was something else, something that made her feel sick. The desperate tone in his voice, the way he was asking for her to come back into his life, made her question everything. What was he really asking for? Did he truly want to make amends? Or was this just another form of control? "I can't be a part of this, David," Amelia said firmly, her voice shaking with the effort to stay calm. "I've moved on. I'm not the person I was when we were together. I've built a new life, and I'm not going to let you drag me back into the past." David didn't respond immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a bitter edge. "You don't understand, Amelia. You never did. This is just who I am. And you always knew it." The words stung, but Amelia stood her ground. "No. I didn't know that. And I'm done trying to understand. You need to let me go. For the first time, David didn't argue. There was a long, tense silence before he spoke. His voice quieter now. Goodbye, Amelia. I guess this is really it. And just like that, he hung up. Amelia stood there, the phone pressed to her ear for a moment longer, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had finally severed the last connection to the past that had once consumed her. But even as she exhaled, releasing the tension from her body, a strange emptiness lingered. She wasn't sad. She wasn't angry. She simply felt nothing. It was done. For good this time. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't David. It was a text from Ethan. I'm really looking forward to this weekend. Can't wait to spend time with you. She replied quickly. Me too. I'm really excited. And just like that, her world felt whole again. Chapter 10. A new beginning. The weekend arrived quickly, the sun high in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the beach. Amelia stood on the sand, her toes sinking into the soft grains, as she looked out over the horizon. The waves crashed gently against the shore, their rhythmic movement calming the last lingering nerves within her. Ethan was beside her, his presence a comforting reminder of how far she had come. They hadn't spoken much about David since Amelia had shared the details of the phone call. Ethan had been understanding, patient, and supportive, allowing Amelia the space to process it all. He didn't press her for more information. He simply reassured her that whatever she decided, he was there. And now, here they were. It was a perfect day for a walk on the beach, the air fresh with a scent of salt water, the sky clear and endless. Amelia felt free. She had felt this way before, but it was different now. It wasn't just freedom from David, from the manipulations of the past. It was freedom from the guilt, the confusion, and the emotional entanglements that had once held her captive. She had come to terms with what happened. She had learned, grown, and now, she was ready to fully embrace the person she had become. As they walked, their hands brushed together occasionally, and every time, a little spark of joy flickered in Amelia's chest. Ethan's laughter filled the air, light and unburdened, and it was infectious. She found herself laughing along with him, the sound of her own joy unfamiliar but wonderful. It had been so long since she had felt this easy. So, tell me again, Amelia said, smiling at Ethan as they strolled along the water's edge. What made you decide on this beach today? Ethan grinned mischievously. Well, I was thinking of somewhere quiet and beautiful, somewhere where we could just breathe, be ourselves. Plus, I know you love the ocean. Amelia's heart swelled at his thoughtfulness. It's perfect, she said. She paused for a moment, catching her breath as the cool breeze swept through her hair. It's funny, she continued. I never thought I'd get here. I thought I would always be stuck in the past, that the past would keep me from moving forward. Ethan's expression softened, and he looked at her with such tenderness that it took her by surprise. I'm glad you're here, he said simply. And I'm glad you're letting go of it. Letting go of what doesn't serve you. Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes tracing the curve of the coastline. I didn't realize it at the time, but that's exactly what I needed to do. I had to stop holding on to something that was never meant for me. That's what made me feel so stuck. Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. It's not easy to do, you know. Letting go. Especially when it feels like the only thing you have left. I didn't know how to let go, Amelia admitted, her voice quiet. But I'm learning. And I'm learning to trust that what I'm building now is real. That what we're building is real. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I don't want you to feel like you have to rush, Amelia. Take things as slowly as you need to. I just want you to know that I'm here. For whatever you need. Amelia felt her heart flutter in her chest, a warmth spreading through her as she looked into his eyes. She could see the sincerity there, the kindness that had drawn her to him in the first place. He wasn't asking her to be someone she wasn't. He wasn't pressuring her to move faster than she was ready. He just wanted to be there. And that was all she needed. "I know," she said softly. "And I'm so thankful for you." There was a moment of silence between them, a quiet understanding passing between their eyes. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy or uncertain. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were exactly where you needed to be. Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Let's just be in this moment, okay? Not thinking about what came before or what's coming next. Just here. Together." Amelia smiled, squeezing his hand in return. "I'd like that." And so, they continued to walk along the beach, side by side, their steps in sync as the waves kissed the shore. The weight of the past felt like it had evaporated in the sea breeze, leaving only the present in its wake. The uncertainty that had once clouded Amelia's mind now felt distant, as though it belonged to a version of herself that was no longer a part of her. She didn't need to look back anymore. She had made peace with the past, and she was ready to face the future with open eyes and an open heart. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or joys it brought, she knew she was no longer defined by her past mistakes or by anyone else's expectations. She was her own person and she was stronger for it. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the water, Amelia felt a deep sense of contentment settle within her. This was just the beginning. A new chapter, a new opportunity to live the life she had always dreamed of. And she was ready for it. With Ethan by her side, she had learned that the only thing standing between her and her happiness was her willingness to believe that she deserved it. She had finally allowed herself to feel worthy of love, of peace, of happiness. And in that moment, on the quiet beach, with the sound of the waves and Ethan's presence grounding her, Amelia knew that the past was truly behind her. The future was waiting, and she was ready to embrace it.